Hello everyone, welcome to this video for PROG1324. In this episode we're going to be looking at a review of data binding your ViewModel to your page, and we're also going to go a little bit farther and make the ViewModel a little bit more responsive. So to begin, I've created a MAUI project, and I've already pre-installed all of the toolkits that we need, the MAUI toolkit and the MVVM toolkit. I've created a model as well as a ViewModel class and a view in main page. So what we're looking at now is our ViewModel class. I've created the ViewModel and performed the inheritance from Observable object, but I haven't yet created any of the properties or commands or any of the other parts of the ViewModel. In main page, I've put in the XMLNS reference up here and created our ViewModel as the binding context for this page, as well as creating a label and a grid. We don't have any controls inside the grid or anything displaying on the page other than this title at the top. And the third class that I have is our model class. So this is our POCO object. It's called invoice item. And we've got three properties: description, quantity, and price, as well as a toString method that returns a string representation of this invoice item. So the purpose of our app is going to be displaying those three properties: description, quantity, and price. I'm also going to create a dependent property that calculates the total cost of this invoice, which is going to be the price times the quantity of items purchased. And we're going to have some user interface pieces that allow us to enter this information into some entries. So I'm going to do the user interface portion of it first. I'm going to create a form where the user can enter the description, the quantity, and the price. I'm going to put these fields all in a grid so that we can keep them organized. We'll start by creating a label so that the user knows what it is they're supposed to enter into here. This is for the first row in our grid for the description. And then after that, we're going to create in the next column an entry so that users can enter in the description. And we're going to create this same style for the next two properties, which are quantity and price. So here's our form so far. Now I'm going to go into our ViewModel and create the properties for description, quantity, and price that we'll be able to data bind to these entries. Now, when we're creating these from Observable object, all we need to make is the private backing fields. So we'll start by creating the one for description. We create the field and then mark it as an observable property. And that will create the property with get and set and all the parts that go along with that. Now I'm going to create the same thing for quantity and price. We create the fields and then mark them as observable properties. Now that we've got these fields created, we can go back to our main page and bind to the associated properties. So we're going to add our binding to description, quantity, and price. At this point, if we run the app, we'll be able to see the values for description, quantity, and price. In my ViewModel, I haven't instantiated any of them yet, so they'll just have their default values, which for the numeric ones will be a 0, and for the string one, we're going to have a null there. So here's what our app looks like so far. We can see quantity and price holding those zeros and description being empty. So our next goal is going to be to create the property that displays the final total. I'm going to create a public double total property. And to calculate the total, we're going to multiply the quantity times the price. Now, because the quantity is an int, we're just going to cast it to a double. Quantity times price. Now we have another property that we can bind to. So I'm going to create a label on our main page to display the total property. So I've created the label here. Just to make it more noticeable, I've got it bolded, and we're going to put in the text to be bound to our total property. Now, because we've got entries for quantity and price, the default on them is two-way binding. So not only are they showing the values from the properties in the invoice ViewModel class, but the change to these will be reflected back into those properties as well. So we're binding two ways. So in order to calculate the total, what we want to be able to do is change the quantity and change the price. However, you'll notice that our total isn't updating. The reason for that is because total itself is based on the two properties, quantity and price. Getting their original values when the page first loads, both of those were 0. And when quantity and price get updated, in our case, updated when we change the entry, we aren't notifying our total property of the change. So observable property raises the events for the user interface on quantity and on price. However, it doesn't raise the events for the dependent property total. So total property doesn't get informed when quantity or price properties change. So in order to make this work, we need to add in the annotations for quantity and price that when they change, we're going to notify our total property. Because total needs to be updated when quantity is updated. And we've got the same thing happening for price as well. When price updates, we need to notify total so that total can update too. Let's give this a try. So here's the app, and I'm going to start by updating the quantity. Let's say we want to purchase 3 things. And when we update the price, say $10, we can see that the total is getting updated whenever our other properties change. Now, if total is intended to be a currency, we can modify how the label is displaying that total by adding a string format property. Now, when we add the string format property, we're going to put it into single quotes and use the 0 to represent the value. And I'm going to use C2 to represent a currency format at 2 decimal places. Now we can see that it's formatting more like a monetary value, and it's remaining updated as we change these other values. Now, if our next goal is to create an invoice item out of these values so that we can manipulate the item, here's our invoice item POCO class. And we're going to create an instance of invoice item in our ViewModel class. So I'm going to create a private invoice item called item. Now, this is only one of many possible techniques to use MVVM with POCO items. Some other techniques involve modifying your item class to make these properties observable properties. However, I like to work without modifying the base models, just because I think it's more realistic to think that if you're making a MAUI app based on something that already exists, you want to try to avoid modifying the models We do have a little bit of duplication of properties because we have observable properties here in the invoice view model, and then we've got regular properties over in the invoice item. But this is one of the more common ways of handling it, so you can maintain your model without having to update it. Really, most of the work that we're doing here is just inside the view model. When we're ready to create the actual item, whether we're going to save it, store it, add it to a list, whatever it is we're going to do with it, then we can make the instance of invoice item and assign the values of our local properties here into the invoice item object. So let's assume that we're going to do that with some kind of save action. So in a method, when we decide we're ready to save the item, what we're going to do is create our instance of invoice item. And then we're just going to set the properties of the invoice item to match the property values that we've gathered here. Now in invoice item, if we had a constructor, that would be an easier way to do things. If we were able to just create an invoice item and pass the 3 parameters. However, this version of invoice item doesn't have a constructor. So we're going to have to use the properties to assign. So when I'm creating my new invoice item, I'm going to say that the invoice items description is going to be populated from this local property. And we're going to do the same thing for the invoice items quantity and the invoice items price. And then once we're done saving the item, maybe we might want to add this to our list of items. Maybe we're going to store it in a file or in a database or what have you. For now, I'm not going to do anything else with this item. It's kind of out of the scope of what I'm trying to display here. The point is we can use the form to create an invoice item object. I can put a breakpoint here in this method just to make sure that it's getting executed at the right time. So how do we know when we want to save the item? Well, I'm going to create a save button on our main page. The save button is going to have its command that is bound to this method. So I'm going to make this method a relay command. And that will create for us a save item command object that we can bind to from our button on main page. So let's go back to main page. I'm going to create a button that will allow us to save the item. And we're going to set the command to our save item command. I want to make sure I place it in the right place. We'll execute the app. We'll click the Save Item button after filling out the form, and we should hit that breakpoint when we're about to create the new invoice item object. So my item, let's say it's a laptop. I'm going to buy 3 of them at $800 a piece. So the price that we're going to pay for the 3 laptops is $2,400. And when I click on Save Item, our project reaches the breakpoint where I'm about to create this new item object. And we've created the item object, 3 laptops at $800 each. So all the properties, the 3, the laptops, and the $800 are all stored in our new item, ready to be interacted with or saved in the system. Now, there's one more piece of the puzzle that I want to discuss, and that is validation. Now, there are a lot of options for validation in MAUI in ViewModels. We have a validator object annotation and a different base class that we can use. Again, it's a little bit out of the scope of what I'm going for here. But I do want to display one of the simpler validation methods, and that is the CanExecute option. So what we're going to use CanExecute for is to determine whether or not the Save Item button is actually available. So it's an annotation that we can apply to the command that is a Boolean value, true or false, whether or not the command is allowed to execute. And if the command is not allowed to execute at a given time under certain conditions, if that's the case, then the button will automatically be disabled in the user interface. So what are our conditions here for being allowed to save the item? I would say that the description cannot be empty, and the quantity and price both have to be greater than 0. So I don't want to save items with no descriptions or negative quantities or missing prices, things like that. We can write a little bit of code in the ViewModel to ensure that the save item command is only available when those requirements are met. So what I'm going to do in my ViewModel is I'm going to create a Boolean method that returns true if our validation requirements are met. I'm going to call it CanSaveItem. And we can do our validation in here, saying that we can return the situation where the quantity is greater than 0 and the price is greater than 0 and the description is not null or empty. So I'm going to use a little bit of code for that, like this. Now, because this is just all combined into one line of code, I can shorten this up a little bit to be the arrow notation. So this thing is going to return true if these 3 conditions are true. The quantity is greater than 0, the price is greater than 0, and the description is not null and not empty. Now, CanSaveItem is a dependent method here. It's depending on the value of quantity, price, and description. So all 3 of these properties. And just like our dependent property up here, we need to recalculate and re-execute this method whenever any of these properties change. So if quantity changes, if price changes, or if description changes, we need to take another look at CanSaveItem. So just like we did with notifying property changed, we need to do the same sort of thing so that when the properties change, the CanSaveItem method gets notified and is able to reevaluate itself. So what we need to add is another annotation, this time for notify CanExecute changed for. So because we're going to use this to determine whether or not our command can execute, it's called notify CanExecute changed. We're going to put in the name of the command that needs to be updated. In this case, it's called SaveItem command. And SaveItem command is the command that's automatically generated when we mark our SaveItem method as a relay command. Now, because CanSaveItem is based off of quantity, price, and description, we need to make sure that our CanExecute changed method is updated for each one of these 3 properties. So whether description, quantity, or price changes, we need to notify our SaveItem command and tell it that it needs to reevaluate its CanExecute method. The final piece of the puzzle is to tell our relay command to use this method for its CanExecute. So we're going to put in here CanExecute, and we point it to the name of our CanSaveItem method. So our relay command is going to use this method, CanSaveItem, to determine whether or not it is permitted to execute. Let's run our app and see how it affects it. So here's the app. When it first loads up, you'll notice now that the Save Item button is disabled. The reason why it's disabled is because our command has determined that it cannot execute, most likely because the quantity is not greater than 0. That's the first thing we're checking, and that's false. CanSaveItem will return a false, and so CanExecute will be false. And if the command can't execute, then the button is disabled. As I fill in the form, as soon as my CanSaveItem becomes true, my button will automatically be enabled. So you'll see as soon as I finish typing in the price, Save Item became enabled. And if any of these become false again, for example, the description being empty, or the values being invalid, we'll see how Save Item becomes disabled when the conditions do not permit it to execute. That's all I've got for today. I hope you enjoyed this video and found it informative. And as always, if you have any questions, please send me an email or come to me in class or by my office hours. We'll see you in the next one.